conversation you're going to have. I'm Ed Sloot. I wrote the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society. And these are my colleagues, really, who know an enormous amount about everything. We are here today. This will be the first of 5 meetings this semester. And we're going to be talking today about spending down, which is one of the more prominent buzzwords in the field. I think we're going to have a great program all year. We've got just about everybody lined up. Thank you, Joel, and a few others, and I think we'd be glad to welcome you each time. So let's start out the way we usually do with just a quick run around the room, your name and who you are and what, in one sentence, your particular interest here might be, so that people will even get to know each other better than before. Kate, you want to start?
I'm Kay Stratton. I'm a senior fellow at MDC in Chapel Hill, and I have just taken over as chairman of the board of Public-Private Ventures, a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia that's facing some of the problems I think you're talking about today.
Barry Morella, I'm with the Center for Strategic Society. David Bramlett, I'm Master of the Public Policy student here at Duke.
Ginger Saul, I'm on the boards of several large international NGOs and a family foundation.
I'm Marty Martin. I'm an attorney in private practice representing nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations statewide.
Katie?
I'm Katie Harold, PhD here in the Stanford School, studying philanthropic foundations in the Middle East.
I'm Kathy Alford. I work in the communications office, and I used to run a small nonprofit business.
Cool.
Karen Ryan, Director of the New Millennium Renaissance Scholars, working with Duke and UNC and NCSU.
Hi, I'm Jess Ayler, and I'm with the Triangle Community Foundation. I'm really interested in this because in the community foundation world, we always talk about sustainability and perpetuity, so this is a refreshing, different discussion.
And I'm Robin Furman. I'm Jesse's colleague at Triangle Community Foundation. I manage our discretionary grant-making programs and our community initiatives.
I'm Dan Gerlach, president of the Golden Leaf Foundation in Rocky Mount.
I'm Tom Lambeth. I'm a senior fellow at the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, and I knew Joel Fleishman when he was nonprofit.
Now he's highly profitable.
He's a profit center, actually. That's in the back.
I'm Alex Reese. I'm a senior undergraduate here studying public policy.
I'm Allie King. I'm a second-year law student.
I'm Gloria Lloyd. I'm a Master of Legal Studies student in Duke.
I'm Megan Golden. I'm a second year in the business school.
I'm Emily Wexler. I'm a second-year Masters of Public Policy student, and I'm hoping to do my master's project on firm evaluation and philanthropy.
My name is Amanda Valeria. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student here.
Chase?
I'm Chase Almeri, and I'm a senior public policy student here at Duke.
I'm Ari Falde, and I'm a junior public policy student.
I'm Lauren Hungerland. I'm a first-year MPP student.
I'm Jillian Grissom. I'm also a first-year MPP student.
I'm Chuck Lovelace. I'm the director of the Moorhead Kane Foundation in Chapel Hill.
Steve Denning, chairman at General Atlantic. We're a large global private equity firm that was started 30 years ago by the Atlantic Philanthropies, which is in the middle of spend down.
I'm Warfield Trice. I'm a former student of Joel's 11 years ago. I'm an investment banker by trade, but I'm on the board of 2 nonprofits, and I'm very interested in foundations.
I'm Patrick Sable. I'm a second-year public policy student. I'm also Joel's research assistant.
Charles Klotfelter. I'm on the faculty at the Sanford School.
I'm Sarah Burdick at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy and Civil Society.
And I'm Kristen Goss. I'm an assistant professor here at the Stanford School, and I teach a course on foundations and public policy.
Great. Thank you all. By the way, students are not supposed to sit in the back all the time. And we have plenty of seats in the front, so you should feel free just to come on up if you'd like.
Yeah, feel free to join us.
Yeah, yes. Students are humans too. Our guests are Joel Fleishman, who you know, who is the faculty director of our center, who's been here for a long time. Here's Joel. And is certainly one of the leading figures in philanthropy. And for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure you mentioned, got interested in the subject of spending down, and now is deep into the subject from many different cuts. To my left, Tony Proscio is a good friend and editorial writer formerly of the Miami Herald, a writer of a number of books, and also a specialist in doing work with foundations in various kinds of reports and other things. And I don't just mean annual reports, but heavy evaluation stuff. And Tony took on a companion piece of work to what Joel is doing, and they're actually doing it together and separately. And so today, I think you're going to sort of play off each other as well as tell your own stories. So however you decide to do it, on.
Decide may be a strong word, but we're going to improvise a little as we go along. But we actually have prepared a presentation to start things off at least.
It makes sense to just talk about the background, how this originated. Or do you want to do it now or later?
You have the fire in the belly, I can tell.
No.
I think it would be a good.
Well, it's interesting the way these things happen, but in this particular case, there is a foundation in New York that I'd never really done any work with before, but I knew most of the trustees, and they called me up and said, look, we're spending down over the next 10 years, at that point it was probably 11 or 12 years, and said that we would like to know what's known about how foundations go about spending down. How about coming in and briefing our board on best practices for spending down? So I said, okay, and I went through the entire extant literature on the subject, and there wasn't anything. I mean, literally, here we've had experience, not a lot of experience with foundation spend downs, but we've had them, and the largest American foundation that we know of to spend down the earliest was the Julius Rosenwald Foundation, which finished its spend down in the 30s. Nobody ever wrote anything about the spend down, except the foundation made a report and they wrote a book about it. But it was not an analysis of how they went about spending down. And from that point on to the end of the century, there were very few spend downs, none of which were analyzed by external observers, consultants, or anybody else. Foundations, a couple of them did, in fact, publish their own reports on the spend down after they occurred, but nobody did it sort of in the middle. And there was no comment about better and worse ways of doing it. Now, the situation has changed, and many new large foundations are deciding, their donors are deciding to spend them down. That really started occurring, I think, in the 90s. And now there are a number of billion-dollar-plus foundations that have been announced as spend down foundations from day one, essentially. Or there are even more individuals who've announced that they're going to give away all their philanthropic dollars during their lifetimes or shortly thereafter. But still, nobody studied anything. So the Avi High Foundation, which is the one where this occurred, said to me, well, look, maybe if you were willing, how about doing a study on us, which we will then make public so that the public can learn from what we're doing. And we're not ashamed that we're pretty confident in our own judgment, and while we will make mistakes, we're not embarrassed about people knowing about them. And so they said, would I be willing to undertake it? And I said, yes, I would be willing to undertake it if it can be publicized, if it can be made available to the general public, and also if I can get Tony Proscio to work with me on the project. That was all occurred in the same transaction. I said, there's no way in the world I can do this by myself, but Tony would be really terrific if he's willing to do it. And then they said, and so after then they had a second thought. They said, look, maybe it would be a good idea to have more than one foundation that we're studying for the purposes of getting multiple data sources. And Atlantic Philanthropies, where you used to work, is spending down. And they said maybe they would be willing to do the same thing. So how about your going over and talking to Carol Marsh, who was the head of Atlantic, and see if he was willing to do it? So I said, okay, I went over to talk to Gara, and we had a conversation. We had 3 conversations over a period, I think, of about 3 months. And I think really what convinced him to do it was Tony Proscio being the person who would handle it. And he said pretty much the same thing. Tony's done work for Atlantic before in program strategy papers of a variety of sorts as an evaluator And so they had confidence in his judgment. And there was no way I could do it, having worked in Atlantic for 10 years. That wouldn't be cricket. They wouldn't be comfortable about that. So Tony actually said yes to working with me on the Avitai one as a junior partner. I said yes to working with him as a junior partner, mainly doing nothing but minor editing on the work that he's doing. He's doing all the interviewing at Atlantic Philanthropies, and I edit his report. He's a professional editor. I'm an amateur editor. And he edits my report. I get him the better of this deal, but nonetheless, that's the way it worked out. I should add to what Ed said. Tony is unique in having written a widely admired book about foundations. In fact, he's done 2 or 3 of them, commissioned by the Edmund Clark Foundation, the first of which was called Foundation Speak. Foundation Speak is all about the peculiarities in the language that foundations use, mainly of a humorous nature. And so if you want to get some really good laughs about this, I would encourage you to get hold of a copy of Foundation Speak, because it's really a wonderful, wonderful little book. And it adds levity to anybody's concern about serious things like evaluation, which Ed said is heavy. So that's my preliminary comments, and now I'll turn it over to Tony to talk about it. We're going to come back and talk about details about what we're learning, but this is just background by way of the
And the title of this presentation, which was entirely Joel's, and I still admire, discloses that we don't have a lot of the story yet. This is a presentation about gearing up. We are only 2 years into this research exercise, and what we're learning now, both of us coincidentally are working with foundations that are going to exist for another 10 years. So the clock in both institutions is ticking at about the same pace. But we're only 2 years into this, and that means that much of what we have to report about now is not how they go about closing their doors, something that actually both institutions have devoted remarkably little thought to yet, but about how they plan for the orderly process of winding down their programs and coming to an end that they can be proud of. So gearing up in this case really is about the process of envisioning the end, not so much yet managing it. I hope we'll have a chance to come back a few years down the road and tell you how they did that. And it will astonish us all, including them, because no one has a clue yet how that process is going to take place.
I didn't mention one thing, which is the idea was, and what they agreed to, is basically annual reports that are based on interviews each year for each of us, in the sense that we do the interviews of all the program staff, all of the trustees, and some of the grantees each year, and then give them a report on how it's going. And it is anticipated by them they want to do this annually every year until it doesn't make any sense to do it at the point at which they're about to close the doors. So it's really a longitudinal series of snapshots of how things are going.
And given that there is so little literature about this, I was surprised to learn that there have been plenty of institutions that have spent down. This is probably not a complete list, although it's a pretty good one, and it's the best one we know of. But it goes all the way back to Rosenwald and has been a kind of a steady stream, although you'll notice a lot of late 20th century institutions picking up there. That is, there was kind of a lull in the middle of the century, and then a lot of more recent institutions. But the interesting point to me was that this is a phenomenon that's been going on for some time, quite deliberately. That is, these foundations didn't spend down by accident, and yet no one had yet gone to the extent of putting together a study on how it works, why it's important, or whether it's important.
What was the rough magnitude of range of spending of those foundations?
Excellent question. Do you know?
I mean, the overall payout or the...
Yeah, I'm just, was
yeah,
it, I mean, rough size?
Well, I don't know the dollars for the Julius Rosenwald Foundation at its peak. In something like $1930, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million. And the money was basically used on things that were not very expensive. For example, the Rosenwald Foundation devoted its entire portfolio after a series of other gifts building schoolhouses for African American children in the South. They built 5,000 schoolhouses, and they did it in a very intelligent way by basically saying to the localities, we'll build you that schoolhouse, but you've got to get basically some part of the local establishment in, that is the white establishment in, to be sure that they see what's happening, because they wanted to get spillovers into improving the schools for white kids at the same time, but they were tackling the problem of schools for black kids. And they spent it all, basically, there, some 5,000 schools. The Aaron Diamond Foundation had probably something in the neighborhood of $300 or $400 million, if I remember correctly. And they spent, most of what they spent in Spend Down, they decided to build the New York City AIDS Research Center, which was phenomenally successful because they hired the right person to run it. They did it in partnership with the city health department, and the guy that ran it ended up being the first to develop the idea of an AIDS cocktail to use for AIDS patients. And it became, so it was focused, and it really did produce an impact that's still significant in terms of charting the way AIDS is treated these days. I don't know very much about the size of these other foundations. They're comparatively small. The Owen Foundation. Did anybody even know about it? It had to be more. Anyway, I don't know. I can't give you a really clear picture. You know that Atlantic Spend Down is starting when the foundation had about $4.5 billion.
Yeah.
So it will clearly be, for a while, the largest Spend Down foundation around, until the Gates Foundation, which is also a Spend Down foundation, but doesn't spend down completely until 50 years after the death of the survivor of Bill and Melinda. So Atlantic is going to be the largest one for quite some time.
Belden was 100 million, so
Belden
that's
was
quite
$100
small.
million.
Yeah,
And they all have different folk. None of them are in the same folk area. They all, from what I know, many of them each had a different slice. So there was no one area that was. We take it in the slices. Rosenwald was education for African American. General Education Board was education. Aaron Diamond Foundation was arts and AIDS research. The Vincent Astor Foundation was mainly cultural, but they did a lot of other things. So confined basically to New York City. The Lucille Markey Charitable Trust was focused entirely on medicine, medical research. The Owen Foundation was really one of the pioneers in creating the conservative network of public policy thinkers, activists, and seeding programs on conservative views of economics in universities. Law and economics, they were one of the large supporters of that. The Mary Flagler Carey Trust focused on the environment primarily. Focused almost entirely on the Belden Fund focused entirely on the environment, and I don't know about the Mott Foundation.
And here are some that are now in the process of spending down, although as Joel pointed out with respect to Gates, not all of them have near-term time horizons. I'm looking for one that has anything as near as 10 years, and I don't believe any of them.
I think the Goldman Fund may. I'm not sure, and I don't know, they have set the limit for the Bronfman Foundation, but I don't know what it is. But my sense is it's near. And you can, so the people up there who, like Pierre Midyar, Jeff Stoll, Bernie Marcus, and Arthur Blank, the two first ones are young, and so they're not going to spend any time. Bernie Marcus and Arthur Blank are much older. Bernie's in his 80s, and so who knows when it's going to be. We hope he lives a long time, but it's indeterminate.
So before we start telling the story of Spend Down, it seemed useful for Joel and me, respectively, to give you some basic facts about the two institutions that we're looking at. And also to recap some points we've already made. 12% of all foundations say they plan to spend down. Now that's That includes a lot of very small foundations and family foundations in particular, and those plans may be like often are like the Gates Foundation, tied to the life expectancy of the founder.
And there are probably about 90,000 foundations at this point, depending on how you define it, whether they're private foundations, corporate foundations, or charitable trusts, but about 90,000 at this point in the U.S. that make grants of some sort.
The idea of spending down is, as has become clear to us in the case of the two institutions that we're looking at, much more appealing in the abstract than it is clear in its implications. Most institutions that are considering spending down have some idea that they would need to wind up their activities, but what that entails is usually a complicated and remote calculation that very few institutions, even the ones that are committed to spending down, have yet approached. The Belden Fund, which did a little, actually an excellent report on its own spend down process, candidly acknowledged that for the first 2 or 3 years, they were constantly encountering decisions that they had not expected and didn't know how to make. That is consistent with the experience that we're having at Abikai and at Atlantic. The idea of spending down also is, for many institutions, more appealing in the remote than in the proximate. So, with institutions that, such as George Soros's Open Society Institute, the commitment to spend down has a tendency to evaporate the closer it gets to the actual time of spending down.
For those of you who don't know, he decided he was going to spend down, and then next year he decided he wasn't going to spend down.
And I still wonder what happens as Bill and Melinda approach the end of their lives and all that money is still sitting.
Well, you notice this is all discretionary on the part of the foundations. There are very few foundations that are mandated to spend down by the donor or by the founding donor. It ends up being a decision that's made. In the case of even the Abikai Foundation, the donor was known to favor a spend down foundation. But he didn't make that decision. He left it to the trustees, and he died before the decision was made. And they made it after about 5 years. But it ends up being a discretionary thing, unless the foundation is set up deliberately as a spend-down foundation. It's discretionary to the people who are the trustees who are still running it later on. And that's where you get the 12% that we decided to spend down. Typically, in some cases, the donors are still alive. At Atlantic, the donor is still alive and kicking. And he was the one who made the decision to spend down. But he didn't make that decision until he set up the foundation in 1982, but did not make the decision to spend it down until 2001. So there are all kinds of configurations, and it's completely flexible, completely discretionary field.
To what extent does the decision to spend down have to do with the foundation's mission? I mean, are the two kind of connected? I mean, schoolhouses are very different from medical research.
I don't know of a single foundation that's made the decision to spend down because their mission got accomplished, if that's really the question. And typically, it doesn't have anything to do with the mission. And they make. Did we talk somewhere later about the question of the different motivations for spend down, or is that something I should introduce at this point?
Why not introduce it? It's not on our.
I did.
It's really a critical issue in the sense that why do people who decided to spend down say they're spending down? And there are 3 or 4 different reasons that all of them give. The one that is most frequent is they don't trust their successors with the money, and they're very frank about it. Either they don't trust their children. One major donor has decided to do that. I know as a personal friend. Said, I want to spend the money myself. I care about the things that I care about. I made the money. I want to put it into those things, and my kids aren't interested in that. So I'm going to give them some money, but the bulk of my estate I'm going to spend down myself for a while. So it's the lack of trust of their own descendants, who would normally be trustees, or it's the lack of trust in what they call, the philanthropoids, defined as people who give away money, give away other people's money, basically. The successor trustees. And you get that from people like fuel was given to that argument by Henry Ford II when he decided to resign from the board of the Ford Foundation, because he said, my father and grandfather would not approve of what you all are spending this money for, and we made a serious mistake in not specifying how the money would be spent, and I'm getting off the board. That was in the early 70s. So there's a sense, and that gave enormous fuel to the fire for people who say that foundations should not be perpetual. They said that, you know, and that's really gained, every time somebody says that, I said, well, you know, this is not a question of departing from the specified goals or values of the persons who create the foundation. That only happens where the people who set up the foundation didn't specify any goals. Nobody has any idea whether Ford departed from what Edsel Ford wanted to do with the Ford Foundation. Their charter simply says this foundation exists essentially in the statutory language of 501c3, saying for the benefit of the human condition or whatever. And so there was never any departure from any stated objectives, certainly.
By the way, if you don't want us to ask questions, you'll have to tell us.
No, I don't mind.
I know you do at some point. You talk about it being discretionary. Have any family members or board members attempted through litigation or some way to reverse the decision to spend down or not?
Not that I know of. But you know, it all depends. If the decision was embodied in the indenture, setting it up, and saying that this foundation is for a limited life, for my lifetime, or my lifetime plus 10 years thereafter, it would be pretty hard to break that. It would be pretty hard at this point for a trustee of the Duke Endowment, for example, that might prefer to have the Duke Endowment spent down, to challenge James B. Duke's decision. Because James B. Duke said this is a perpetual foundation. It will do the following things, and the following things are specified in his trust indenture, setting it up, and he required in his will that trust indenture be read every single year in its entirety to the assembled members of the Board of Trustees every year, so that they would always know what he wanted to spend the money on. You couldn't break that.
You could read it in fact.
Well, it is. So, okay, so to go back to the, did I answer you?
I just wondered, even where it's not, where there is no trust document or anything, it says, I think it would be remarkable if you would, if there are that many, you're talking about 35,000 foundations either planning to spend down or considering it. That's an awful lot. It would be hard to believe that there were 35,000 boards where a decision might be made and nobody would try to reverse it by whether they had a clear statement about spending down or not spending down.
Well, most of the foundations that have spent down, and indeed most of the foundations that are spending down, are all family foundations. And you know from your work with family foundations that the boards
they all get along.
They all get In fact, Tom is the chair of an organization called the National Center for Family Philanthropy. And one of the major actors in that. But in any event, to go back to the different motivations, so I talked about lack of trust in the successors. I've talked about lack of trust in the philanthropists, but there are a couple of other factors. One of them is, and this is also typically stated, that the money is needed to solve problems now. And I would much rather spend the bulk, all of my assets, solving problems now in the short run, and leave it to future generations to generate charities that will support tackling the problems that exist then, later on. And you can see the difference because the perpetual foundations typically spend 5% of their assets on an annual basis. But these are people who are saying we want to spend more. And some of the foundations that are spending now, like the Goldman Foundation, even now is spending upwards of 15% annually, 50% of its endowment annually. So that it's really decided that it's going to spend itself down in a gradual way because you can't maintain buying power, foundation buying power, through spending it at 15% of what your assets are at that point. The final reason that's given really has to do with the fact that these people, particularly, when did this happen? It happened when you began to get large concentrations of wealth in the high-tech field, for example. Most of these people who have the billion-dollar foundation that is spent on are high-tech people. They're also people who have high engagement with their businesses. And so about the same time, what you found, people who had made their own money and who were engaged really, who one might say, if one wanted to disparage them, they were control freaks. They really wanted to see how their money was spent and to direct how their money was spent, wanted to engage. Come in, Sonny, if you have time, or not if you don't. Stop the look. There are people who engage in the active management of their businesses, and they want to engage in the active management of their philanthropic dollars as well. And so it's a sense that, and that is certainly characteristic of Jeff Skoll, it's certainly characteristic of Peter Midyar, it's certainly characteristic even of Bernie Marcus for that matter, and also Arthur Blank. Pat?
You might get to this later, but I was wondering, is there a different sense of legacy with these groups? I mean, the people are doing the spend downs in terms of they don't want their name carried on into perpetuity, they're more interested in just solving the problems. Is there any sense that that has any relationship to these spend downs?
Well, it varies. And you know, they clearly feel deeply ambivalent about that. Because both of us have remarked that in the case of Chuck Feeney, the founder of Atlantic Philanthropies, he said when he announced, I was at the board meeting, when he pulled out it was the funniest thing in the world. It was a lined sheet of paper from a tablet that had these rings around it. And so he had written this handwritten note, which he wanted to read to the board. And he said, I've decided finally that I would like to have this foundation spent down during my lifetime, or shortly thereafter. And he said, so you know, he said, and I want the money to be spent on ways that would produce a measurable legacy. I don't know what that means. I mean, the sense of measurable legacy. I mean, and they've been struggling with that. I don't know whether they talk about that anymore.
All the time.
What?
All the time.
Well, and Atlantic and Avi High, they clearly want to achieve a legacy, but they don't want to say that. And they, somehow the notion of leaving the legacy seems somehow philosophically incompatible with the idea of spending oneself out of existence. But the truth of the matter is that they really do want to keep a legacy. They want a legacy not so much in the name of the founder, because his name doesn't really show in the name. Avi Chai means my living father. And it doesn't show. It's not the Sanford Bernstein Foundation. He chose it. None of his philanthropies are named for him. So it's not leaving a legacy in that sense, the way the Rockefeller Foundation is named for John D. Sr. And the Ford Foundation is named for Ford family. But it's a legacy in the case of Avi Chai in the things that they've been supporting that are central to their mission, essentially. But they don't want to call it a legacy because it gets confused in people's minds as a legacy for Bernstein, not for the program. But they feel ambivalent.
So there's a question of motivation, I think, that you were asking too. But
yes.
And in none of the cases I know of, which I know Aaron Diamond and Belden pretty well, in addition to the other two, in none of these cases did somebody say, I want to leave a legacy and therefore we're going to spend down. It was generally the other way around. I want to spend down. And oh, that means that on a date certain, everything I'm going to do charitably will have been done. And that is by definition a legacy. A terrible thought to some people, that is terrifying, but inspiring to others, and maybe a little of both for most people. It's a consequence of the decision to spend down by and large. It would be interesting to know of somebody who decides, as Chuck Feeney might have, he didn't, but he could have decided, what I really want to do is build a great university and then be finished. And therefore I'm going to spend down doing that. But I haven't run across a case like that yet.
The question I have is, we're talking the two extremes. I mean, perpetual versus spend down. And it might be a subtlety of the research that you ultimately move to as to what is in fact the objective function. Is it focused on the needs, or is it focused on perpetuating the endowment or perpetuating the foundation. Because, I mean, I would argue that on some of these, it's a result rather than an input. And you know, Omidyar, Skoll, and so forth, I think they're focused on, and first and foremost, focused on addressing certain needs and going after certain challenges and problems in the world. And if the end result is it's spent down in 10 years or 20 years, I mean, that's just a function of how I in fact address these needs. So, I mean, it's interesting to me as you address these two extremes, you know, where we really come out in the end.
Well, Atlantic started out, as you know,
Yeah.
not really caring what the calendar was going to be. It made grants in amounts that were not sustainable in perpetuity, but it hadn't set an end date and hadn't even in fact decided that this was going to be a spent down foundation. It was partly the arithmetic that drove the decision. Some plans have to be made. As the endowment was starting to get smaller, it became increasingly clear that some of the grant relationships and some of the philanthropic purposes that the foundation was pursuing were someday in the foreseeable future going to be left high and dry because this foundation was going to be spent to zero. So we had better devote some time to thinking about how that proceeds in an orderly way. And to the extent that you care about where you leave your grantees at the end of the foundation's life, the more you worry about that, the more, first of all, you're going to be inclined to set a date and plan a deliberate spend down, and second, the sooner you're going to do it, because these things take time. It's interesting to me that at Atlantic and in other cases, the more international the program is, the more anxious they become about the orderliness of the conclusion of the activity, because there aren't very many foundations in most other countries to pick up the work. You're going to have to leave these organizations in a stronger position in some conditions to preserve themselves, or else plan their demise as well as your own. All that need for planning starts to become clearer as you see the arithmetic playing out in your activity. And my impression of Omidyar is exactly that it proceeded the way Atlantic began. We're just going to spend what we need to spend, and then they realized we're going to need some orderly conclusion here.
In the case of Atlantic, I would say that Atlantic's operating, it's the largest foundation operating in Ireland, or the north of Ireland. It's one of the it's not the largest, but it's one of the largest foundations operating in South Africa. It is the largest foundation operating in Vietnam. Isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
By far. And so, you know, you're dealing with, when you're in that kind of a situation, and then you've done all kinds of extraordinary things, you know, creating fragile new organizations to deal with social problems. Think about the various social problems that a foundation could deal with in South Africa and post-apartheid. In the case of Ireland, it was Atlantic that really was responsible for the transformation of the Irish university system. They put hundreds of billions of dollars into that and have enough position in the country to leverage equal amounts from the government in the process of doing it, and challenging the government.
So let me take a prerogative here and ask our two speakers to go through what they have prepared, because we may just lose a lot of that.
Well, we've done part of that in this.
And actually, we'll probably find
you may find a lot of
yeah, because the next thing we were going to do was just kind of take off a description of these two institutions, and we'll start with Joel and Avichai.
Well, you see what it is. At its peak, the endowment had about $1 billion, and it was spending at the rate of about $60 million a year at that point. The endowment now is about $600 million. The focus program interest up there it is really a foundation. It operates in 3 countries in North America, actually 4 countries: Canada and the U.S. in North America, Israel, and the former Soviet Union, essentially. And the programs differ according to the 3 geographies. In the case of the United States, it really is a focus on trying to do what it can to foster Jewish consciousness education, Jewish religious purposefulness, Jewish literacy, and most of its programs concentrate on supporting Jewish day schools and Jewish overnight camping in the United States. In Israel, the strategy was different because Israel's situation is different. In the United States, the Jewish community is greatly challenged by the secular culture, by the pluralism of the culture, and the difficulty of maintaining Jewish traditions across generations. And so you see very significant changes because of that, and that led Bernstein to want to do something to strengthen Jewish consciousness and knowledge. In Israel, the programs have really, the problem there is really more of mutual understanding, not just talking about understanding between Jews and Arabs, but mutual understanding among Jews. And so the programs there do concentrate on programs focusing on mutual understanding, trying to bring all kinds of Jews together, whether they're religious or secular and different denominational flavors and everything else, and work more together and be less antagonistic, which is a challenge. And in the former Soviet Union, it's different in the sense that Judaism as a religion was suppressed along with all other kinds of religions during the communist period, and therefore their concentration there has really been on doing things that focus on building the basic institutions of Jewish culture and learning. They've given money, they've started centers as we have in the United States, in a couple of the Russian universities on Jewish studies. They've created a network of day schools there. They've created a network of camps and things of that nature that they've done that one would think about just basic initiative kinds of things which have never been done there. And there are three separate program staffs, one in New York, one in Jerusalem, and one in Moscow. The program. There's one board of trustees for the foundation that sets its policy, and with a basically strong chair who takes great pains to see that the money is spent well, and who works closely with the other trustees and the staff. Is there something else I should say about other comments? In a sense, that it is one of the largest foundations in the Jewish education and culture field. At one point, it probably was the largest, but it's certainly among the largest asset foundations in the area of Jewish education and culture.
And Joel, if I'm not mistaken, everything you've said about its program interest and focus and aspirations, all of those things were true before it had decided to spend down. That is, the decision to spend down did not alter the program at all.
It did not. It absolutely did not. And, just to go back briefly to Steve's question, I think there are lots of different reasons for spending down. I don't think there's any one. And I think that but the dominant decision really is made by every one of the spend downs we know about was made by the donor of the foundation. And it was not because they wanted to accomplish something with their money specifically. It was they disliked the idea of perpetual philanthropy. You go back, Julius Rosenwald was amazing in that regard. Although Andrew Carnegie really preceded him by 50 years in writing that rich people should give away their money during their lifetimes because they can, and he said in the Gospel of Wealth, because you'll be better able to be sure that the money is spent on things you care about and in an efficient way. That's what he said.
He even said that those who leave their money to be spent after their death usually leave nothing but a monument to their own folly.
That's exactly correct.
And where's the Carnegie endowment now?
Several billions. But in any event, so I think the decision to spend down, by and large, gets made as an independent variable in the analysis, because they don't like the idea of one of the reasons that I gave earlier of a perpetual foundation. I don't know of one of them that made this decision on the basis of having, because it felt that was the best way to achieve its mission. Charlie?
May I just follow up that last comment of yours? Could you say at some point how the giving to endowment relates to this decision? Because endowment is also perpetual, and
But if you can't really generalize, most of the foundations, well, in the case, as you would expect, all of the grantees of Avi Chi expected or hoped for an endowment gift at the end. Nobody's getting an endowment gift because the trustees decided that that's merely copping out. That if you really want to, if you really believe in non-perpetuity of the foundation, you certainly don't want to transfer part of the foundation to a grantee that's going to be perpetual. And so Avi Chi has done no endowments and is going to do no endowments, period. Atlantic is not clear at this point because, as you know, you may know, Chuck Feeney has, the general policy of Atlantic was not to give endowments, but the truth of the matter was Atlantic has on occasion given money basically in lieu of endowment, challenging endowment building, and by which you would give money for operations, which would then, and the money that they would otherwise have spent for operations could be put into endowment. So basically triangulating the gift in such a way as to give an endowment, but not give an endowment, basically. And I don't, but they're still trying to, their current leader, Carolyn Marsh, came over from Open Society Institute, George Soros' domestic programs in the U.S., trying to figure out whether it makes sense in terms of what Chuck Feeney wants to do to give endowment gifts at this point. But most of the conversation there has been not to. I don't know what it is. At the same time, you know, even in recent years, Chuck Feeney, because of his founder, a founder trustee, and he was the donor of the foundation, has had a prerogative to make large gifts to organizations that that really aren't in the program priorities of the foundation as a whole, as a foundation. And so it has made, you know, I don't know what the gift, a large gift to the Stanford Medical Center for the Cancer Research Center, a large gift to the University of California, San Francisco for another kind of medical center, and so on. And so it is, but those are not endowment gifts, they're really capital gifts, right? Capital building gifts for private groups. So the other foundations, none of the others that spent down that I know about gave endowment gifts. But that's the way they think about it in a sense. If you're really passionate, if your donor is passionate about non-perpetual foundations, they don't want to give endowments because that seems to violate the notion.
Is the presumption here that after the spend down happens that something else will come into play to further these causes, or is the presumption that this is it? I mean, it's not sort of dwarf wheat or 911 that are going to be picked up.
It is a very good question, and that is certainly the case at Avi Chi, and I guess that's the case at Atlantic. The things that they have been focusing on, where they really care about, and at Avi Chi it's clearer because they've had the same set of missions and the same set of programs for all the years that the foundation has existed, and they want very much to see those programs be carried on. The problem is that they weren't doing things to assure the likelihood that that would happen. And so one of the big criticisms, if you want to read both Tony's report on the first year and my report on the first year of these two foundations, is up on the web, on our website here at the center. And you go back and you look at it and you say, one of the major themes in my report last year, and I don't know whether it was true in Tony's report, was the question, well, what are you doing about capacity building for the grantees? What are you doing about recruiting, soliciting partners to participate, partners and successors to participate in your grant making? And in the case of Avi Chi, it was nothing. During all of its previous existence, it didn't pay any attention to that, yet when they reached the point when they were forced by the prospect of spending down, what all quotation attributed to Dr. Johnson, that the prospect of hanging wonderfully concentrates the mind. And that really made them focus on this, but they didn't do it, they just started doing the capacity building now. If they had been recruiting partners all along and getting partners to join in these efforts, they would have there are plenty of other foundations in the Jewish world that could be doing some of these things if they wanted to do them. But the problem is, Avi Chi always felt that it could do it all itself. As long as it had not proclaimed itself a spend-down foundation, it didn't feel any need to do it. And many organizations received 90% of their money, or all of their money, from Avi Chi. And so now to go out and to try to solicit money from prospective partners or successors, it's a lot harder to do because they've not been taken into the council of the organization, there's been no cooperation going along, and you've got fully formed programs which these prospective partners have not had a chance to help shape.
As they're spending down, are these foundations increasing the number of grantees or simply increasing the number of the size of the gifts?
Well,
The grants, rather.
the Ami High Foundation, and I can't speak for Atlantic Clinic and say something about it myself. In the case of Ami High, once they made the decision to spend down, which they announced, they made the decision in '99, after Zalman Bernstein died, but they didn't announce it publicly until 2004, 2005. They then began to figure out what they could do to narrow the number of grantees. And they went through a process of comparing all of their grantees with each other. And then they decided, and on the basis of which ones are most centrally focused on our mission and which ones are performing at the highest levels, those two characteristics. And they picked the grantees then, the ones that were dead on with the mission and were doing a great job. They said, well, we're going to do what we can to strengthen these organizations during the remainder of our 10 years, and the other ones we're going to phase out very quickly. And that's what they've done.
Now, Atlantic had already set itself on a path of overspending before it deliberately decided that it was going to spend down, so it didn't have to confront directly the mathematics of what do we do with the rest of the money. They were already spending the rest of the money, so to speak. But they did come to the conclusion, a highly controversial one within Atlantic and one that we could debate here, that in order to spend down on a planned calendar, you have to have more focus in your program. So having originally had something like, what was it, Joel, 16 areas of activity at the foundation, and even those were kind of loosely defined, it zeroed in on 4 program areas, concentrated within those areas, concentrated on a somewhat smaller number of grantees that they had a lot of confidence in and put a lot of money into those grantees. So, but that was a decision about orderly management of the spend down process, not a decision dictated by the arithmetic of spending down.
Yeah, I'm a little bit troubled by this, and I guess in thinking about it, dollars going into the foundation benefit for use of the public through the exempt status of the organization. So where are the attorney generals in this process to intervene in behalf of the public good, say that these trustees perhaps are violating their fiduciary responsibilities as trustees in authorizing a spend down?
Well, I mean, on what grounds, where the foundation decided, the donor decided to spend down, what grounds would the attorney general intervene in?
Well, first, I go back to your comment about the James B. Duke. I think if you went in and looked at that, it's very clear. He said it's a perpetual foundation, and so the terms are very clear there. But in the instance of corporate fiduciary responsibilities to operate with the duty of care and what an ordinarily prudent person would do, and I'm not certain that an ordinarily prudent person would necessarily spend down all of their dollars in the pursuit of.
You talk to the people who are spending down. They think they're doing exactly the prudent thing to do. And I don't think, frankly, I don't think there's an argument that would be made that would justify any kind of action by the attorneys general under those circumstances.
Well, I suppose it would be, you know, I love to practice law without an education or a license. I suppose it would be if there were any statutory language that suggested that the tax exemption was allowed on the basis of perpetuating philanthropy or good works or something. As far as I know, there is no such statutory language.
I don't think so. Ginger?
Except, this is an example where there is statutory language.
Yeah, there is, with respect to that foundation.
They would have to try to get the money back.
To add to that, there was in Congress over 100 years some debates about that, but the most recent one was, I think, in the 70s, 69, which was partially a result of the Tax Reform Act of 69, where a number of senators, and most prominently the father of Al Gore, Senator Gore Sr., argued for 40-year lifespan of all foundations to be put into legislation, and came very, very close to pulling it off. But foundations and lots of folks pushed back, and it disappeared from the land.
Well, the Treasury actually ended up, it was the Treasury proposed 2 alternatives. Without going into the history of the 60s and the concerns about foundation management, there was a sense that foundations were hoarding their money, and that therefore something had to be done, and that they were hoarding their money, adding a fillip to it, to the benefit of affiliated for-profit corporations that were controlled by the donor foundation. And there was a sense that there was too much hanky-panky going on between the trustees and the donors, and therefore they needed to do something to be sure that the money got moved out the door once the foundation was done. The Treasury proposed two alternatives. One was to put a limited life on foundations of 40 years. The other was to create a spend-down requirement annually of 5 to 6% of assets. And it was the latter one that was accepted overwhelmingly. I don't think, I wasn't paying this much attention at that point, and I don't know how close Senator Gore got to getting it done. But I sense it, I've talked to the people in the Treasury, and they said it didn't look like that was the 40-year limit was going to happen. Yes. Tom Troyer told me the story.
But I had an interesting conversation with a financial manager at Philip Coates at Atlantic, who sort of in his mind, because he's a quantitative kind of guy, quantified the charitable calculation of spending down in a way that would strike me as highly defensible, just in terms of public purpose. He said, if you believe that the present value of all the good you can accomplish by spending money today is greater than the present value of that, greater than the value of that money today, then on purely charitable terms, as an act of public responsibility, you ought to spend the money today. And for example, that kind of thinking led Atlantic into a fateful decision to choose to have a children's program, which is turning out to be problematic for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. But the idea was, by improving the lives of children today, you're going to set in train a succession of charitable benefits in terms of their healthy development and their contribution to the economy and their raising of their own children and so on, that would be far greater than if you left the money in a bank and spent it on their grandchildren. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily the correct answer, but I'm saying that that is as responsible a decision about the administration of charitable dollars as it would seem to me anybody could morally ask. I'm not in a position to pass on the law, but there's certainly no question in my mind that the decision to spend down wasn't based on a very sophisticated calculation about charitable benefit. It clearly was.
You didn't get a chance.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another lens to look at this with. It's from the large amounts of capital in the foundations and thinking about their availability for program-oriented related investments and as this spent down and the capital is dispersed, that there's not the potential for that type of investment.
Well, I think that's right, and is another factor. At some point, we ought to talk a little bit about the question of spend down, perpetuity versus spend down, because I do believe that perpetual foundations play a very important role in society that the spend downs don't. They do different things. They do different kinds of things, and that if those people who care about the kinds of things that perpetual foundations are doing, would not accept the notion that spend down foundations are the way to go. And we can come back to that, but let's get a little bit more granular about these decisions before we get back to that larger question, because I think it is an arguable point, and many people, the current predominant view among the people creating foundations today is the spend down is the way to go. I think that's a wrong decision as an overall matter. It may be a good decision for them, and I do believe that people should do what they want to do, that is donors. But I don't think in terms of argument about social benefit that is as clear cut as they think it is. But let's go back to try to do what it is.
Yes, right, and to spend a minute on Atlantic. The biggest difference between the way Atlantic and I have approached the idea of spending down, at least the biggest consequence of their different attitudes towards spending down, has been in the way they treated the content of their program. Atlantic, in its decision in 2001, it really started in 99, it was kind of a multi-year decision. At the same time it decided to spend down, also decided that it needed to focus its program. So this list of 4 program interests you see on the right-hand side here is new. And it was a significantly longer and more varied list of interests before the decision to spend down was made. Now, having said that, you might ask, why would a spend down foundation pick these 4 areas? What is it about these 4 program areas that would be uniquely suited to a limited life institution? And the answer, as far as I can gather, is nothing whatsoever. The 4 areas were picked because they were interests of the trustees that they felt passionately about and really wanted to pursue, or they represented areas of great talent and strength on the staff, or in most cases both. The trustees that I've spoken to, which is most of them, recall only one discussion in which they were weighing a program interest specifically because it would be suited to a limited life, and that was global warming. There was a remarkably brief discussion about whether that ought to be an interest of the foundation, given that it had limited life. And here, if you buy the science of global warming, it's a now or never kind of intervention. There are very few things in philanthropy that really are now or never. This would be one. Why don't we do it? And the answer was, first of all, no one on the board and no one on the staff knows a damn thing about the environment. We've never had any involvement in that area. Second, Mr. Feeney isn't particularly passionate about it, so it doesn't express the founders' great interests. And third, let's think about it later. And it never came back up. So these areas that did come up could easily have been, and in many cases are, program interests of perpetual institutions. The next question for Atlantic was, what should we do within these areas that is well suited to a limited life? And they came up with very different answers in each of the cases, but those answers generally had to do with building some capacity in the field that didn't exist, that could at least take off on its own beyond the foundation's limited life. I guess I should say we've already probably made it pretty clear that this is a much bigger foundation than Anakai. It's $3 billion, give or take now. It was very close to $5 billion at its peak. And they're paying out, have been paying out a good deal more than $400 million a year in the past, but that's the goal. And it took a little while to get what was always an aggressive grant-making institution to rein itself into a deliberate calculation. I just want, since we talked a little about endowment, this is another area of some difference between the two institutions. And Atlantic's two relatively small institutions that you may not have heard of, although they're very well respected in their 2 places of operation, and they're growing. The problem is, unlike the ACLU, which will march along just fine with or without Atlantic, it's not at all clear who could support those 2 Irish and Northern Irish institutions. You don't want a civil rights or human rights watchdog taking money from the government, but there aren't very many other possibilities in either of those 2 places. So if Atlantic doesn't endow them, and there's been no decision about that or even yet serious contemplation of that, but if Atlantic doesn't endow them, they may well go out of business. That's one of those life and death kinds of issues that you have to grapple with if you're a limited life institution, then you can really kick down the road if you're not.
Tony, let me flip that for a moment. It's also the case, is it not, that 2 institutions like that, in many senses, would be too small to accept large annual gifts.
Right.
There's just a question of scale and the ability to handle huge infusions of money without program, people, and so on. So it's a double-edged sword. And how to figure out what to do seems to me to be doubly precarious.
That's absolutely right, but there are 10 years, or let's say 7 years, because the last commitment will be in 2017. But there are some years left to figure that out, and one obvious possible solution would be to find a parent institution, be it a university or some institution of civil society that would accept the endowment on behalf of these two organizations, or you spend the next 7 years building up the administrative financial capacity of the organizations to accept an endowment on their own. But again, neither of those decisions has yet been taken. Atlantic did do one thing, apropos of Joel's earlier comment that it has toyed with endowment-like relationships. The Committee for the Administration of Justice in Northern Ireland, Atlantic funded a building for them, a really big building for a not really big organization. They're renting out the other floors and taking the revenue as essentially the equivalent of an endowment. That was intentional. There were no surprises about that. It was essentially Atlantic giving an endowment that wasn't an endowment. So, unless there are any questions about Atlantic, we can now move on into the.
So is that considered a spend down or not? I mean, you were making the argument earlier that it wasn't.
Joel was actually making that argument. I have been a neutral observer of that debate at Atlantic for a long time. Is it spend down or is it shadow perpetuity? And at that point, I'm starting to think the issue is semantic. Harvey Dale, who was Atlantic's first CEO and is still on the board, points out that everything is perpetual. That when you make an endowment to build an institution, even when your money is gone, the institution lives on. Nothing in this world is finite. We all live forever in Harvey's reckoning, and there's truth to that. Is it shadow perpetuity, or is it a big bet on something that's going to last forever? Chuck Feeney, who doesn't believe in endowments, nonetheless has built a lot of buildings for institutions that will live on long after we're all gone. Those buildings are no different, really, from the Committee for the Administration of Justice building. The university's using those buildings to perpetuate its mission. It's a great question, though. I mean, as a dedicated semanticist, I'd be happy to argue the meaning of the words for the next 3 hours.
But Harvey Dale cannot mean that it's equivalent to just operating expenses. I mean, so if your expenditure every year is to give out food, that's different than building a building.
Yeah, and Harvey doesn't give out food. You're right. There are ways of spending money that would not be perpetual, but the sorts of things Atlantic does, which are heavily dedicated to building institutions and movements and fields that will go on, that's really what Harvey's talking. But sure, if you're running a food bank,
I've dealt with it firsthand. I mean, Harvey will make the argument that endowing a particular institution to carry on the very mission that when you established it is in fact spending down. I mean, that's his argument.
In fact, that was one of the plans that he had. Actually, you want to talk about that if you want to.
He made it, I have to say, linguistically elegant case for what he called the exogenous Atlantic philanthropies. That is, that the life, partly mystical, partly financial life of Atlantic beyond the end date, in which he was arguing that the foundation could essentially just hive off pieces of its endowment. There are financial reasons for this, which I'll get to in a second, but just hive off pieces of the endowment and place them here, place them there, give them to a university to administer for this purpose and to a great institution to administer for that purpose.
And the staff.
And send the staff along with it. At the Ford Foundation, we used to call this floating out on a big one, when a couple of staff people took a $10 million grant and set up an institution, and that little department of the foundation lived forever. Harvey envisioned Atlantic essentially breaking off into a bunch of little perpetual pieces. And when I asked him, isn't that somewhat contrary to the spirit of giving while living, since all those things will still be giving long after Mr. Feeney and all the rest of us are gone, he said, Chuck Feeney already gave while living. He already parted with all that money. He gave it to an institution. He can't spend a nickel of it on himself. That job is done. The only question is, in the great story of human affairs, how long is that money going to continue doing good? That's a decision we get to make, according to Harvey.
We lived it firsthand, because when you look at it from the other side of the coin, which is how do I invest the capital to in fact generate the return to pay for the programs that we're talking about, it has huge implications if all of a sudden you're cutting the lifespan. So the exogenous one was one where you could continue because it allowed some perpetuity with regard to the funding mechanism.
Sure. Well, investments in General Atlantic Partners were right at the core of that
Yeah.
discussion. Here's something that if you liquidate it precipitously, simply because you've got a clock on which you're supposedly spending down, you may come to a point where it's not the right time to liquidate those investments, but your spend down calendar says this is the point in which you have to part with the money. Well, Harvey would say, why not, instead of liquidating the investments, simply pass them off to the University of California at San Francisco or some other great institution, and on they go. Or Cornell at the time. Okay, so to sum up, we better sum up quickly. The lessons that we've learned so far. Again, these are lessons from gearing up, not from spending down. Joel, you want to?
Well, I mean, it surprised me tremendously in the sense that Abichai, they made the decision to spend down in 1999, but it took them until 2009 to take the first step towards even thinking about how they were going to spend it. And Tony said it's pretty much the same thing in Atlantic, which is they all assume that they can make these decisions in a very short period of time. But the problem is that, as the second point suggests, you need years to implement the plan and to get a lasting result. Moreover, if you're dealing in the cases of Abichai, for example, which is dealing with grantees it has never done any kind of capacity building with, and suddenly now they've got to start raising money on their own, and most of them don't have boards that are capable of raising money on their own. Most of them have never been through any kind of a strategic planning process. Most of them don't have the slightest idea of any kind of an adequate communications strategy for their missions. So you can't wait until the last minute, because in order to ingrain those habits and capacities in the organization, they need some practice in doing it. So my view is, and I said to this at Abichai in the report this year, which is not up yet, I said, the truth is that an organization takes 5 years from the point at which you do this to get into the habit of understanding how to raise money, and has had enough of a track record that it's had experience in raising money, and all the other kinds of things that you do when you build a capacity of organization. But to wait so that, at this point, this is really the last point at which they can actually engage in a serious capacity building effort that is likely to increase the survivability of their grantees. So it really is just, the second, I won't have anything to say about this, the fourth point, or the fifth point. We can talk about them if you want to do that. What is really interesting to both to Tony and me is that when we did the interviewing on the first year of the spend down report, and mind you, it was the first year after they began doing the spend down, last year there was very little staff anxiety about anything, frankly. And I asked them, and we both asked the questions, and we didn't find anything. This year, there's a lot of anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
And why that is, it has to do a lot with the pace of the pace of the organization, and there is the pace of the trustees in making decisions, so that the staff can in fact tell grantees what's going to happen to them.
When you can see that sunset.
Yeah.
Well, also, staff at Atlantic, and I think this is a little bit true at Abichai, but less so. At Atlantic, if you ask any individual staff member, have you got a plan for how you're going to conclude your little portfolio by 2010? They can give you a highly detailed plan, but it's organization specific, one institution at a time, and to some extent, that's necessary. The way a human rights organization transitions away from support by Atlantic would be completely different from a public health institution in Vietnam. But the lack of any collective institutional judgment about these things has given free range for grantees to have essentially use their own imagination about how their life will end, and in almost every case, their imagination is they're going to get an endowment. So
even on the high, when they've said over and over again, no endowment, there are still grantees I interview who say they're still hoping for endowment. I don't know.
As part of your research, have you spoken with any grantees? I'm thinking specifically from the Belden Fund because I work with several of their former grantees. Have you spoken with any of them post spend down to see how's it going? How did their intentions play out in the year ahead? That would be very interesting.
I've been doing that. I've got a couple of grantees in each of the program areas that I plan to keep checking back with. Again, it's still early, but it's a rare one of those that hasn't said, well, of course, there's always the good chance of an endowment at the end. And we'll see. I'm curious to see when the cold shower of reality hits them. Or, in my case at least, less so with Avitai, but in my case, some of them may be right.
It's also the case, what was interesting to me was there's not a lot of anxiety about what will happen to them in their jobs. That is, the staff people, what will happen to their jobs? What will they be doing after Avitai goes out of business? That's not the source of the anxiety. The source of the anxiety is, particularly among program managers who've never done capacity building organizations before. They've handled just aspects of the grant. And now suddenly they're forced individually to focus on capacity building. And the foundation has talked about assigning somebody in the foundation really to be sort of the director of capacity building, to work with all of the program officers and grantees in it. And they're worried about whether they have their own capacity to do that kind of thing well. And therefore, they worry that maybe the foundation will have to bring on somebody new, and what will happen to them at that point. So there's a kind of uncertainty about that, but not about the longevity. The foundation has said to them, look, everybody that's here can count on having a job till the end of the period. But you know, but that doesn't solve the problem. These small staffs, there's no room for growth. And so I picked up from people this year, well, you know, the problem is, you know, I've been here for a while, and I can't be promoted anything because it's very flat staff. And so am I going to continue to grow in my professional life, or am I simply going to just have to stay here and not be able to do anything beyond what I'm currently doing?
And as the sunset approaches, it will be interesting to see if they provide incentives for that last year or those last 2 years in order to keep staff that they need.
And they
really play out.
That they would do that. I mean, they've told everybody, you know, that you participate in the pension plan and everything all the way to the end. Just Phil? Pat was first.
Sorry, I mean, you basically answered my question, because it seems like the big problem is that at the exact moment when people are starting to realize that they're running out of the ability to move up in their positions, or that they're going to lose their jobs, they actually have more pressure than they probably ever had before, and having to develop a whole new set of skills and looking at their programs in a completely new way. And that's so much of a change when you know that you're not going to be there 5 years from now. And how do you retool a small staff in order to accommodate those large changes?
What is also interesting on that point, now I want to move to another question, but we can, because we're going to try to end at 6 o'clock, and I want to give you all time for general discussion if you like. But on that particular point, you know, what I'm picking up with a lot of the people that I would tie, once they begin to engage other foundations, which they're starting to do, in order to try to work out interested partnerships, a lot of them are starting to get job offers in a way that they didn't get before, when they were basically below the radar of everybody else in the field. Nobody's taken the job, and none of them that I interviewed this year said that they were seriously pursuing it, but they're sort of flattered by the idea that others are interested in them, as you would understand. That's great. And so that helps, I think, strengthen their own sense of their confidence in what they're doing, and gives them some sense that there are people out there who would like to have this, and typically it's a young staff, so you're not talking about people, these are people who will finish Avitai before they're in their mid-40s. And so if they've really proven themselves, they've got opportunities there. But I want to go to another question, which, why am I interested in this? It's not because, particularly, of the fascination with spend-down foundations. The main reason I suddenly discovered this in the process after the first year of interviewing, I said, you know, what these foundations now are going through and having to decide are the kinds of things that every perpetual foundation ought to be doing anyway.
Yeah.
Because what they're trying to do is to increase the efficiency with which they're spending dollars. They're trying to target their focus in order to get things done that they really care about. And they're doing it in a way, in a self-conscious way. The notion of having a grant rating, having a board of staff and a board of trustees comparatively rank the success of their grants and their centrality to what the foundation exists about is really novel. Most foundations don't do that. And so the notion of being a figure, creating, in my book and in the talks I've given, I've concentrated on the fact that foundations really do underperform. They underperform in large part because of the fact that there aren't any built-in accountability measures, internally or externally, for that matter. And and so the foundations that are spending now are doing things now because they have to, in order to at least satisfy whatever sense of legacy that they're trying to build, but to get the biggest bang out of the buck that they're doing, and to do it in an intelligent way. Because they have to, because they're faced with spend down. So for me, the question is, what kinds of comparably influential incentives can be developed to get the perpetual foundations to do the same thing? Because there's nothing the spend down foundations are going through, including in the way in which they're investing their money, that the perpetual foundations shouldn't be doing right now. That's the interesting question to me at this point.
Sounds like a paper guy.
Well, it is at some point. But when I want to be sure I'm solid enough in all of our data that Tony and I might do it together. But don't you agree with that, Tony?
I do, but I'm skeptical that a perpetual institution would ever have the mental discipline that a spend down foundation has, simply because there will be a day on which these two foundations, on which any idea that these two foundations might have will be irrelevant because they're going to be out of money. And knowing that for certain gives you an incentive to plan carefully and to be unforgiving in your at least your internal accountability, in your judgment of the wisdom of what you're doing, that a perpetual foundation would never absolutely have to do. It would always have the luxury of extending the program a couple of years, or declaring victory and starting a new program that harvests the lessons from the old one, or floating some of its staff out on a big one and essentially creating an external version of its program. That you'll always have the luxury of a little extra time and a little bit of opportunity to revise your history that neither of these foundations will have. I mean, they ought to do it. The question is, could they ever be made to do it?
Well, I'm not suggesting they'd be made to do it. I mean, I don't believe, I'm not talking about government.
Oh, God, no, I didn't mean that.
I want to be clear about it, because my critics will they certainly have enough to say about things that I say without that argument. But in any event, but there are examples of perpetual foundations that are doing these things. The Commonwealth Fund ranks its grants, internally grants, every year. That is, trustees rank all the grants, staff ranks all the grants, and ones that people say are not really central and not really performing very well, they weed out every year. The Edmund Thomas Clark Foundation is doing a lot of what the capacity building kinds of things. That's really what they've gotten into in a way probably more than anybody else, but they're not the only ones. The Fidelity Foundation does the same kind of thing. The Hewlett Foundation increasingly is doing the same kinds of things. If you talk about foundations that are scrutinizing their programs with really serious social science research, then that's what the Wallace Foundation is doing. That's what the Lumina Foundation is doing. That's what the Irvine Foundation is doing. So the question is, there are some foundations that have bit the bullet, and they've said we're going to start doing things better because we do care about the efficiency and effectiveness with which we spend our money. The bulk of the foundations are not doing it at this point, and there may never be any substitute for the prospect of banking. Maybe they
Joe,
won't. Yeah.
The whole discussion today has been on the programmatic side.
Yeah.
Because, obviously there are huge implications to how one manages the underlying endowment, the financial resources, if it's perpetual versus spend down limited life. And do you intend to explore that particular avenue in great depth?
Yes, the question has been raised by people we've interviewed, and the answer is yes, we do plan to explore it. We've not done it so far, in large part because the issues on the program side would just seem to be much more pressing at this point to the trustees of these two foundations and to the program staff. We have interviewed in every case the persons running the investment function at these foundations.
The interesting thing, I would argue that the financial actually precede the programmatic just because of the lifespan involved here, you know, because, I mean, I think it's public knowledge, but after 30 years, the Atlantic Philanthropies is no longer a limited partner with us, and that is because they really can't make those long-term commitments if they're really in a spend-down mode and they're making their final commitment in 2017, so in 7 more years. So it has huge implications for, you know, the means whereby you can pursue the various things we've been talking about today.
And chronologically, those decisions did, in fact, in both cases, precede the discussions about program. Both institutions were very clear on how the end was going to look financially before they even began thinking about how the end would look programmatic.
It's sort of interesting in that context just to mention that there is one thing about IFI that I didn't mention, which is that they did decide at the same point at which they decided to spend down the grant-making function, that they were going to leave $125 million for endowment for an institution that they're setting up in Jerusalem, that they've set up in Jerusalem, which is going to produce educational and cultural programming there in perpetuity. So that in a sense, they did a little bit of perpetuity with respect to part of their, you know, $125 million at the point at which they made the decision was about 10% of what their assets were at the peak. So they've done that, and it's just in a sense, and then they've been planning. So they're planning, they're very insistent on being sure that whatever they spend in the interim is still going to leave when they close the doors at $125 million in current purchasing power for that foundation. Chuck, did you have a
I don't want to switch off the financial per se, but I'm intrigued by your fourth bullet point, and that is our foundation is really spending time worrying about that in the spend down process, because I mean, we can be a legacy in our own mind, but isn't that for really post spend down to judge, for history to judge?
I think everybody to a person whom I interviewed said exactly that. Legacy, if you spend your time worrying about legacy, it's going to drive you crazy, it's going to distort your judgment, and it's really for history to decide. And then the entire remainder of the discussion is about what our legacy is going to be in every case. And the word even. Now, I've spent a good portion of my career ridiculing words that I then turn around and use. So I understand, I'm very sympathetic to this, but I will get a 10-minute lecture on how the idea of legacy distorts everything you do, followed by a 45-minute discussion of what our legacy is going to be. And, you know, that may be a good thing for many of the reasons that Joel was describing about the kind of mental discipline you get when you have to think about an end date. Many of the staff people, I'm convinced, now this is pure impression, I haven't subjected this to any research, but I'm pretty sure that many of the staff people at Atlantic who have turned down job offers at longer lasting organizations have done so because they're concerned about their own legacy. Many of these folks on the staff at Atlantic are really distinguished players in their fields. And even though it's Mr. Feeney's money and ultimately will be his great legacy, what they accomplish is going to be part of their resume for all time, and it's going to be accomplished by some date in 2020 and not to be revised thereafter. So the idea is personal, it's not just institutional.
Two more, no. Hang it up. Bill?
I'm happy to yield if you want to move on to the next stage.
No.
There's no urgency.
I don't think we have another stage.
Well, we do have one last stage,
yeah.
And I want to introduce it is, and that's just a question. I'm really agnostic about the issue of whether foundation should be perpetual or spend down. I think, as I said earlier, it should really depend entirely on what the donor wants to do. believe that very strongly, because philanthropy is personal, and people make those decisions personally. But I do think, and while I do see all the virtues of the spend-out foundations, I think it's really important to keep in mind the virtues of the perpetual foundations, as I said earlier. They do different kinds of things. The perpetual foundations, because of their long life, can in fact stick with problems for a long time. And you look at the cases that we've done that are in my book on foundation impact. Virtually all of them were significantly multi-year commitments. The Rockefeller, the longest one was the Rockefeller Foundation's commitment to the Green Revolution, almost 30 years. And so you get that kind of capacity with institutional knowledge and willingness to stick with things over a long period of time that you just don't get. The typical, you look at what the non-perpetual foundations are doing with the spend-down foundations, they're doing things to focus on current issues, and they're usually doing things, current problems, and they're usually doing things based on a very short time horizon. They're involved in a short time horizon. When you think about, you look at what the perpetual foundations have done, where did the new disciplines in academia and science come from? They came from foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation put up the money to seed the study of microbiology and genetics. And if you listen to what Crick and Watson say, they said the whole revolution in the understanding of the gene would have occurred at least 20 to 30 years later, but for the Rockefeller Foundations putting departments of microbiology and microgenetics in universities. The same thing is true about, that's just one of the things that these perpetual foundations, you wouldn't find that with people doing the donors to spend out foundations. That's not what they're interested in doing. That's not what they're doing at this point. And if you think the humanities, they don't do anything with the humanities. The perpetual foundations are the sole source of support. The humanities, the primary source for the arts, most of the spend-down foundations don't do the arts. They do social problems, they do poverty, they do education, they do a variety of things of that nature, social enterprise kinds of initiatives. Who is going to do, where are you going to get the kind of money to tackle the long-run issues? The perpetual foundations do basic research. The spend-out foundations do applied research when they do it. And so I just think it's really important to keep in mind that you look at the dynamism and the robustness of American society, and you look at where a lot of this knowledge generation is coming from. Much of it is being fueled by grants from the perpetual foundations. Now, there may be exceptions to that rule, but that's what strikes me in looking at the record. And that's one of the reasons that it's not a clear-cut case, that the social benefits that occur sooner because of spend-down may be offset by the kinds of social benefits that can accrete only over a long period of time by people focusing on things over a long period of time. So I just wanted to enter that into discussion, and it's a way of saying that I'm interested in foundation effectiveness and efficiency in getting the most out of their dollars, whether they are spend down or perpetual foundations. And it's really important that the perpetual foundations learn about the kinds of things that the spend downs are doing. That's why I'm doing the study. That's why Tony's doing the study. Now, before I open Steve.
Because I also think there's a huge amount of capital given in this country, and you two would know the real facts, that is capital that is maybe with people that have less means, but give virtually 100% of it away in their lifetime to certain causes, whether it be the arts here at Duke or some other cause. And I mean, they're not at these two extremes, but they have an enormous impact.
Yes.
And so somewhere in there, how do you capture that and measure that with, the thousands of foundations that are probably are under 100 million in assets that will literally spend down, but spend down through endowing perpetual organizations?
Well, the answer, the field of impact studies of what foundations do is so young at this point. Just today, I got an email from the Foundation Center where you can actually, they've now got a part of a website on their website. They're now beginning to try to get information about impact of foundation, particular initiatives. Just now, it has not been there. When John Abler, who was one of the speakers this fall, the co-founder of Boston Scientific, he's setting up his $1 billion foundation. He called me up and said, Joel, we want my trustees, fellow trustees, his wife and their children are interested in the following subject matter. We would like to know what foundations have done and with what consequences so that we can see where we can target in the best. He said, where can I go for that information? I said, I laughed and I said, John, there isn't any place you can go for that information. It's not gathered anywhere. Nobody knows. But you think of your remarks remind me about Ruth Lilly's gift of $100 million to the American Poetry Society.
Exactly.
Which is, there are many examples of that kind of thing, but they're not collected anywhere. It's anecdotal at this point. But the floor is open for any comments or questions from anybody for the field.
Yeah, the things that sort of I'm leaving the discussion with that I found were particularly interesting is the idea of sort of to borrow a term from finance, kind of the present value of your efficacy. And I think that matches what you just said about there's a matching principle. For a long-term goal like furthering conservative thought should probably have a different funding mechanism than a short-term goal, like funding an experiment to see whether 911 would work, or very short-term. So that's sort of the first thought. The second is that I like legacy. Legacy is a high standard. Legacy means you make a difference, and whether you're a wind down or a spin down foundation or a perpetual foundation, you ought to measure yourself by making a difference. And it makes people nervous. I can imagine why people think about it, but you ought to have that as your goal.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I do celebrate the increasing frequency of foundations that are spending serious dollars to measure what they're doing. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation historically spent about 13 to 14% of all of their available income on research and evaluation. It's now 25%. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is only one of the foundations that puts a lot of money in it. The Wallace Foundation, I don't know what the percentage is, but they do rigorous social science evaluations of every one of their major grant-making initiatives with teams of external social scientists they put together just for the occasion. When the Packard Foundation was adopting its major program to put every California preschooler into preschool in the state of California, a 10-year project, they put together a team of social scientists from Harvard, and they said, we want you to document this program. We set up the benchmarks for performance. We want you to document this and give us a report every 1 or 2 years about how it's going, what we need to do to fine-tune it, and you're free to publish whatever you want to publish. That's rare. Foundations, if they did that, typically, they would keep the reports to themselves. But to have the Packard Foundation doing that, to have the Wallace Foundation also doing it, same thing, you can publish anything you want to publish on the basis of the research. And now to have the Ali Khai Foundation in Atlantic come along is really rare still, very rare for foundations to be willing to make these documents public. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted to do it, because I felt it was another step in opening up foundations to external scrutiny and to help them focus more on these accountability issues, what they're doing by way of results.
One thing I would say to add to Joel is what we've begun to see in the last couple of years is a move by foundations to start to publish their own reviews of their own grantees. It's not only how the program is going, but as more people are getting interested in accountability and impact and how it happens, we're starting to see much more talk and some action on putting up on the screen, how did the Boys and Girls Club of Philadelphia do? And as that begins to take root, which will take a few more years, it will start probably to lead to some kind of greater dialogue and then maybe ultimately some triage in how people do their grant making. It's a trend not yet trend, which has enormous implications for the growth and stability of the sector.
But it seems to me you have to be careful with your evaluation, make sure you know what to get measured, right?
Of course.
Because otherwise what happens is that then you get a perpetual evaluation, right? So clearly what we need is another, amount of money to go evaluate this some more. We just don't know enough about it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, but that's the challenge a lot of us in the state foundations are what we figure out.
Absolutely. Well, at some point,
right sizing that, right?
you're probably facing a lot with a new foundation, pretty much. It'd be interesting to get some comments, not today, but on how you're doing, what you're doing. I think it's time at 6:15, so we'll move to wrap it up. Thank you all. I have a couple of short announcements. One is, as Joe briefly mentioned, these analyses and stories are up on our website. And was there more?
Putting up the website.
And they're really good reads. They're fluently written and very insightful. So I can't encourage you more to go if this is a subject that turns you on.
And there is also an extensive list of other documents on spending down. You'll see it down there toward the bottom. Joel's and mine papers are at the top there, but the page continues with a lot of good stuff.
Thank you.
Go back to the link.
That's great. Thank you.
Go back to the link. Oh, back to the link.
CSPCS.
And there's another.
CS, you don't even my narration. Yeah, they can do that. A couple of more things. First, Joe encouraged me to do this, so I've just done an edited book with Paul Bloom, who's a professor at the business school, and some of you might find it of interest. It's called Scaling Social Impact, New Thinking, and it's a compilation of papers that we've put together based on two conferences we held last year and the year before. There's a fair international tilt to it as well, but if the issue of social impact is of interest to you, you can pick this up from Calgrave and McMillan. And one of the most interesting papers I mentioned is takes lending, micro-lending down, and it's a very interesting way of how it's done, because most people think it's quite successful. So anyway, interesting book if you want to pick it up. Let me then finally say who our guests will be. Sarah gave me our agenda that I didn't have for the next 4 sessions this semester. On the 5th of October, John Abeley will be here. John is the founder of Boston Scientific, a major medical technology company based in Boston, and has founded the Argosy Foundation, which is a very quiet foundation, actually. And John will speak from his own perspective. Joel is very good friends with John, and he is a businessman through and through, so he may have his own story to tell.
Also a visionary. He's a visionary businessman.
Right. Most interesting man. I'm going to miss that one, I think, but I'll pick up they're all on tape now and film, so we have it. On the 19th, thanks to Marty's help, Lois Lerner will be here. She's the head of the Exempt Organization Division of the IRS. And she will be talking about what she does, and a subject that lots of people are concerned about, but don't really know much about. How does the IRS work in here really anyway? So we're hoping she will be an assistance to us in learning that. 2 speakers in November. The first will be Nancy Rube, who runs the Edmund McConnell Clark Foundation. Many of you know that as being really out in the forefront of slimming down, first under Mike Balin and now under Nancy, and pulling together growth capital funds that are helping to really move excellent, high-performing nonprofits into longer-term growth and development. Fascinating story about how it's being done and to some extent replicated by the feds now.
And you've all heard of Harlem Children's already. Well, it was the Edmund McConnell Clark Foundation. It really did get them going.
It's big pop. So Nancy has been there with it all the time, and Mike's been there, was there, and she succeeded him, so very, very interesting. And finally, a return engagement. Rick Rapson, who runs the Kresge Foundation, based just outside Detroit, will be here. He spoke a couple of years ago, and just as he had taken over Kresge, and was, I guess, in the middle of uncertainty, confusion, but wonderful stories. Rip is a good friend of ours and mine, and they've probably, in my view, been one of the two most thoughtful and creative foundations that have virtually turned themselves around. Before Rip got there, the only thing that Kresge did was give capital grants to build buildings, and never started the grant. They always were the last one in. So they hardly did anything that had much thought behind it except write checks. Now Rip and a few others have been formative in trying to bring the Midwest back. Have started their special initiative in the Michigan area to revive the Midwest industry, to replan, rethink cities and how they belong, where they belong, and particularly Detroit. And Rip, I'm sure, will reflect on that. So we've got 4 more superstars coming, and I heartily encourage you to show. Coffee will be free. And, I'd like
You mean the Lambeth coffee service, right?
And
A legacy.
Then, yeah, just I'll add one footnote about Kresge and Rapson. It's another example of what leadership can do. He came to this foundation that had never had any kind of scrutiny about its performance. Right. And he commissioned a grantee perception report survey from the Center for Effective Philanthropy to do this thing. They came up with a devastating critique. I mean, it's something like 25% of the grantees really thought that the foundation didn't really understand what they were doing. And it was just downhill across the board. He said, we're putting it up on our website. And they put this grantee perception up on their website, and it was just a really courageous thing to do, basically showing how little contact that foundation had with its grantees. Very interesting fellow, and he has succeeded in doing what he's doing. That's all I have to say.
thanks to our 2 speakers today.